Welcome to the OLLI at SBU lecture series. Today we have David Eisenberg, who's going to talk about Tolkien, and I'll let him get started right away because he can give more information on his background and the presentation. David?
Okay, good morning, everybody. Hi. So, my name is David Eisenberg. My profession is grandfather, babysitter. I used to be a lawyer, I'm still a lawyer, actually. Just interested in a lot of different things, history, literature, philosophy, you name it. I pretend to be retired for many, many years now, so I can do this stuff because
He's been practicing retirement for a while.
yes, since 2005.
It's nice that you don't have to actually pull the plug, but you can still do a little bit if you want to.
Yeah, that's what I try. I have a saying, I work more than I want, less than I should. That's probably accurate. So anyway, today I'm going to be talking about Tolkien. The name of the topic, I think, is Tolkien and the Greeks. In particular, it's really about 5 words in The Lord of the Rings. I know that's hard to believe because we're scheduled for an hour, but it's a literature discussion. So there's going to be a lot of other authors and whatever we're going to talk about. Just a quick question. How many of you have read, sitting here anyway, The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit? None
I
of you.
read The Hobbit when I was in college,
Okay.
long time
None of
ago.
you have read it?
So
Okay.
the movies.
All right. So I don't think you need it for this lecture. It's like I said, it's a literature lecture, and I'm going to just tell you a little bit about it. You saw the movies? Who saw the movies? One?
And what about people at home?
Can they tell me?
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody at home? Have you read The Hobbit? Do you want to unmute yourself? Anybody at home?
Did you see the big thing they did on Tolkien in one of the magazines? Either
No,
National Geographic or Smithsonian, they did a whole thing on him.
It's fascinating. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about him now. So Tolkien was born in the 19th century, late 19th century. He lived early on in South Africa, but he was British. Fostered young, World War I, horrible experience for him, of course. And he was a genius in a lot of ways. He spoke parts of at least probably 15 to 20 languages. He concentrated in what he taught. He was a professor at Oxford, which is pretty impressive itself. He taught Old English, Anglo-Saxon, it's the same thing. But he spoke Old Norse, or read it anyway, which is Icelandic, all the Romance languages, Latin, Greece, Russian, you name it, he spoke it. But he did 2 other things that were remarkable. One, when he became a professor at Oxford and Leeds, he became the foremost expert on Beowulf. He wrote a famous essay, which I'm probably going to forget the name of it, but basically changed Beowulf research. It may not mean a lot to you, but they used to look at it like historically. Who is this Beowulf? Was he real? What, and trying to fit in the different names, but he changed it really to a literature discussion.
So he wasn't real, Beowulf?
Beowulf is not a real person. No. So it's, come on in, come on in. We just got started, it's okay. Anyway, so he did that, and then he also wrote what many people think of as the greatest novel of at least the 20th century. I will tell you that between The Hobbit, which is a children's book, where he just introduced these characters, little people called hobbits, and they had an adventure where one of them, and by the way, the hobbits represented sort of the English people, where one of them went on an adventure with some dwarves and to steal a treasure back from the dragon. But it was very English, so like the dragon wore a waistcoat, gentlemen. And they smoked pipes and things like that. So it was a kid's story. And then he wrote The Lord of the Rings, which he started, published The Hobbit in 1937. Still a fairly young man. Took him 16 years to write The Lord of the Rings. I've read his correspondence which is, honestly, it's a wonderful book because he was a great writer and people didn't email, they wrote letters. So he'd write to his children and to his publisher, and you get to watch step by step. I don't know if any of you have heard, because not many of you have like read it, but Bilbo and Frodo. Frodo, of course, is famous. He's the star of the Lord of the Rings. His name originally was Bingo. And Aragorn, if you know who he is, he was the great king and soldier of it, was originally another hobbit. So the story over 16 years just changed. And it started almost like another children's story, but then progressively got more and more serious, became a war epic, and really was about everything. It's the book, and this is what's amazing to me, and I've studied it for a while. By the way, you can go to Oxford now and take courses. There are literary societies about it. There are publications just dedicated to scholarship, and just like might be in Dickens or Homer or somebody like that. It's a great story, and that's what most people see. And probably more people have seen the movie than have read the book. It's close to 300 million people, which is, I don't think, any other author in history. Some say that Don Quixote Cervantes that's sold more. Maybe, who knows? But 300 million is a lot of people. And like I said, I read it when I was a kid. I don't remember one. I'm going to say in my late teens or early 20s. It was just a great story to me. I wasn't interested yet in anything, to tell you the truth.
I wonder how many other authors followed and like I'm thinking like Star Wars is kind of similar to like Lord of the Rings in the
I'll get into
progression of
that.
the story.
Yeah, I'm going to get into that. Yeah. So,
I just wanted to say, I read The Hobbit in college, and then I started reading the first part of the trilogy, and I couldn't get into it. I don't know what it was.
well,
It was different than reading The Hobbit.
a lot of it's more serious. There's no doubt about it. So anyway, let me explain. So he writes fantasy novels. It is a fantasy novel. Some people feel, it's for kids or whatever. He wrote a very famous essay talking about that and saying people love dragons. People remember dragons. They don't remember boring characters who, go about their lives and whatever. And the proof in the pudding, as I say, is that 300 million people almost have bought his book. It's billions of dollars now for the movies. So anyway, I'm not a big fantasy fan, even though this is my all-time favorite book. I find that even though it's not my genre, the best of it are my favorite books. And for me, there's got to be a connection to real mythology or real history, like no interest, or usually no interest. I liked Harry Potter. It was okay, and they have witches and goblins and all that stuff. But it's when I hear people compare it to Tolkien, I get angry inside. I don't say anything, but I really do. It's a totally different thing. But you don't need to know anything to watch it and enjoy it or read it and enjoy it.
One of our workshops this summer, we were having a discussion, what's the difference between fantasy and science fiction?
Well, fantasy is a larger group. Science fiction is a fantasy novel about futuristic science. That's what I would say, and I think it's accurate. Anyway, but he probably perfected the craft, because you look at any fantasy book now, the next Tolkien, everybody wants to write the next thing. What's that one that was on TV? Game of Thrones. I tried reading it, my friends loved it. There was no real mythology. It's all made up names and whatever. So I lost interest. So in The Hobbit, again, it's about these little creatures called hobbit. They're people, but they're a smaller species of people. And it's supposed to be Europe 10,000 years ago or something like that, even though obviously it can't be. So the dwarves are a creation, a species that lives in Middle Earth. The elves, who are not little, they're 7 feet tall and beautiful, almost angelic, not quite. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. And then there are bad elves called orcs, who are goblins. And there's all kinds of different wizards. Gandalf is the most famous one, probably you've heard of him. So he started writing about this world in 1917. He's probably about 25 years old. And it was just for him and some things for his kids. And it's only when he got older, he wrote The Hobbit. He was a poor professor. He used to not pay as well as it does now. And he used to do little extra things to make money. So anyway, he basically started writing this and then eventually became world famous as an older man. He died at age 73. I mean, he got a few years to know how famous he was. His son, Christopher, also an Oxford professor, wrote far more books than Tolkien ever wrote about his dad and his works. There's probably about 15 to 20 books. I think he's passed away now too. He's probably in his 80s or 90s. But there are many books about the scholarship and how it started, and each time he made a change. Some of them are okay, some of them are not so interesting. It depends. If you really love the stuff, you want to read it. If not, you wouldn't be that interested. Anyway, other people started writing about him. I told you I read his correspondence, one of the best books of correspondence, and I read a lot of those that I've read. There's a guy named Tom Shippey, who I'll talk about a little more in a minute. Tom Shippey followed, not that he knew it, Tolkien through his grade school, high school, rugby team, went to Oxford when Tolkien was an old man. He knew him about a year before Tolkien passed. And then Tolkien actually went to Leeds and he went there too. So his whole career followed him. He's written books from as a professor of literature about Tolkien. Some of them are really good. Not my favorite book. My favorite book about the Lord of the Rings, if you want a short book that sort of explains everything, and I think I actually read this before I read The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. It's called A Look Behind the Lord of the Rings. Lynn Carter, who was a good fantasy editor and a pretty bad fantasy writer, but he wrote this book about it and explains a lot of interesting things. So, what did Tolkien love and what was he trying to do? He was an expert philologist. He means he studied texts, as I said, he learned many languages in order to do so. He loved what he called, and I think it's the right word, nomenclature, how things are named and why. And he wrote a letter to his son once, where his son gave a history lecture. And he wrote to him, that was wonderful, just things a father should say to his son about his lecture. And then he goes, the truth is, if there's not something in history about how things or places or things are named, I don't have so much interest. And that was true of him. It's not completely true. I mean, I love history for itself, but I admit it, that if I can learn like where a name came from, I'm so excited. I can't explain it. I maybe just grow up that way for some reason. Anyway, a lot of the names and a lot of the mythology from the Lord of the Rings comes from two places. One was called Norse mythology. Are you all familiar with that? Like the Scandinavians, now we have Thor in comics and Odin, right? Marvel superheroes and whatever. But this was the Viking religion at one time. So, and also, as I explained, he is an expert on Beowulf. So a lot of the Lord of the Rings, you'd be surprised how much is taken right out of Beowulf. And Tolkien changed everything. He didn't just take it and put it in directly. He changed it a little. So the name Middle Earth, because that's where this all takes place, is an ancient Norse Scandinavian name, Midgard. Probably anything you see, that's how you would see it written now, M-I-D-G-A-R-D. Really, the D's are usually THs, and I don't know why when they write it in English, they change it. They do. We don't have the letters they do for the TH sound. I'm going to put up a slide, if you can put up the first one. So those may look like a lot of gobbledygook to you. If you read The Hobbit, you may recognize some. These are the names of the dwarves in The Hobbit. I'm not going to read them all, but see, they sound kind of silly. Keely, Feely, Dory, Nori, Boffer, Bomber. The last one is Thorin Openshield, which in Icelandic is Thorin Eisenberg. I actually looked that up for the talk, as I say. And if you saw The Hobbit, the hero of it, one of the heroes, dwarves, the chief dwarf, was Thorin Oakenshield. All of those names comes from a place. They come from a book known as the Elder Edda, EDDA. And that's a Icelandic book. There are two Eddas. Nobody knows what Eddas means. Some people think it's where the writers were from, or it means grandfather. They just guess, but nobody really knows. So the Elder Edda was a collection of poems that really, it was written in the 13th century, right? 13th century, but it was really from the Viking era, and they were just passed down over time. It then disappeared, written in the 1300s, disappeared until a bishop found it in his library. Somebody sent them something in the 1600s. And then there's one called the Prose Edda, which is much easier to read. If you just said, I want to read about Norse mythology, you don't read the Elder Edda. It's too hard. It's poetry. I don't think you'd enjoy it so much. The Prose Edda is a lot more fun. That's written by a man called Snorri Sturluson. Which? Prose, like I write prose. Yeah, Prose Edda. Yeah, so Snorri Sturluson was the author, also in the 13th century. As I'm preparing for this, I'm like, everything would be a good talk. Just his life story. He was a writer, but he was a lawyer. He was an adventurer. I think he died at the end, killed by his former chieftain. It's just a lot of great stories in literature. So a lot of the words that you were going to hear that are in The Lord of the Rings, for example, an orc. Have any of you heard of orcs?
It's in the crossword a lot.
Oh, is it? Okay. So they're the bad guys. They're the
Times.
okay.
I know it now because several times.
The orcs comes. Sorry. ORC. So orcs comes from Beowulf. Tolkien thought it meant demon. Actually, they've learned since it probably meant like something to do with a corpse. And they were elves who were tortured and then became these weird goblin-like monsters. Mirkwood, there's the forest Mirkwood right out of North Ents, and we're going to talk about Ents a little, ENT. Ents, if you watch The Lord of the Rings or saw it, it's a giant half man, half tree, and there's a race of them. Ent is just a Norse word for giants. Another one, other than all these, that's like I said, a list from the Elder Edda, which I've read. I put Balin in black because it's the only one that isn't from there. Balin, he may have gotten from King Arthur. One of the knights was Balin, who's also a fascinating story, even though we don't talk about him anymore. But anyway, another one I'm sure you heard of is Gandalf. Gandalf was in the same list. His name actually means either wand elf or magical elf. And a lot of the names of people in The Lord of the Rings came right out of Beowulf. A lot of them, there was a group called the Riders of Rohan, who were sort of like the English, except they rode horses. And everybody's name started with EO, and EO is Old English for horse. So in The Lord of the Rings, there's a character, Eomer, which, what is it? I'll tell you. Oh, horse famous. Then there's Eowyn, which means delight horses. So again, for Tolkien, this is important to the talk, everything was about language and words. And when you learn this and you read it, it means something else. Anybody who studied Tolkien at all or knows anything will tell you, it all comes from German or Norse or Scandinavian mythology. But I'm going to tell you that's mostly true. Like the title of my talk is Tolkien and the Greeks. And I'm going to show you what I've discovered, which I find pretty interesting. So I just want to go first to if you go to the next slide, that's what we call it.
I think Balin, B-A-L-I-N, is the last name of one of the people that's very active in our OLLI program. That Balin.
I doubt it's the same one.
No, but I wonder if she knows.
It's from King Arthur. So, why did Tolkien write it? He tells us right here. Nobody believes me, he wrote this to his son, when I say that my long book is an attempt to create a world in which a form of language agreeable to my personal aesthetic might seem real. What does it mean? I'm gonna tell you. He made up his own languages. In The Lord of the Rings, the elves speak several languages. Now, I'm not somebody who ever learned these, I don't care. But a lot of people actually learn the languages. The dwarves had their languages. The Mordor, which was the really bad place, sort of like hell, had their own language, which nobody else would want to speak. And then there was a common language that everybody spoke, which was sort of supposed to be English. The Riders of Rohan, what they were speaking was related to Old English, Anglo-Saxon. And then there was Gondor, which was, I don't know if it's like Rome or something like that. It's a city of very highly developed people. And they got their language from the elves, who spoke several languages, some which were developed, he said, from Greek or Latin, Finnish, other things. So he had his own languages. The other thing he said, which is important to remember for my talk, is he wrote to a woman, but once upon a time, my crest has long since fallen. I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and I can't say the word, cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, which I dedicate simply to England, to my country. He wanted to create a mythology for England, which really didn't have its own mythology. There was the Vikings who invaded, and then there were the very old people. He had a couple. King Arthur really came from Ireland and Wales, which wasn't considered living. Now we call it Old Britain. And so those were his two goals, to make a world where he could have his made up languages and it would fit in and to create this thing. Now he says, my crest has long since fallen, but he succeeded wildly. People read this stuff, people read about Norse mythology because of Tolkien. Barely anybody would otherwise.
Isn't he the one that Stephen Colbert quotes constantly? Tolkien, Stephen Colbert
Talks about it?
on the Night Show. Yeah, that's his favorite book.
Oh, it probably is a lot of
He
people's favorite.
quotes him constantly.
I quote him constantly too, actually.
He's one of the people who speak those languages.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, believe me, there are people.
That's how much he loves
Yeah,
that.
there are people who know a lot more about it than I do. So anyway, let me get to what I call my discovery, because I think I discovered this one thing. Again, it's only about 5 words that none of these scholars seem to have hit upon. And it's interesting to me at least. But before I get right there, I'm gonna do 2 quotes for you, which I keep thinking about as I was, again, preparing it. The first is from Thoreau. Thoreau, the American naturalist, it's my favorite, personally, my favorite writer. He writes a lot about nature and many other things. And he wrote in his journal, the question is not what you look at, but what you see. We're going to see how that fits into this. And then the second one is from Tolkien. Bilbo from The Hobbit says to his nephew, Frodo, it's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to. Both these things happened to me. I was looking at something and I saw nothing except the printed words. And then later, when I gained certain knowledge, I saw a lot more. And also this silly tale I'm about to tell of just my literary adventure was getting swept off my feet. I had no idea it was about to happen to me. So I'm going to go back to Tom Shipley. I mentioned, wrote a few books. He's the guy who was a professor also at Oxford, followed Tolkien. He was also a consultant on the movies, and many people think the greatest Tolkien expert in the world, anyway. So he wrote a book called The Road to Middle-earth, How J.R.R. Tolkien Created a New Mythology. And he's like Tolkien, he's a literature professor. So when you read it, it's a literature book. I read it when it came out, probably 2003 or 4. I seem to recall sitting in the library reading it, actually. Later on, I found a used copy and I grabbed it. I don't know why, and I just threw it on my bookshelf. So there's a chapter in it called When All Our Fathers Worshipped Stocks and stones. Those are important words, stocks and stones. So here's what Tom Shippey says. He takes you to a scene in The Lord of the Rings. Everything is over. The wars are over. The good guys won. The elves are about to go back to their ancient homeland, leave Middle Earth, the magical world is diminishing. If you ever see the movie, there's a song at the last credits, and I'm not kidding, I cry when I hear it. It's called Into the West, sung by Annie Lennox. And it's about diminishing the end of things. Just a really beautiful song. You can look it up in your Spotify. It's called Into the West. You know, she has a stunning voice to begin with, but she was perfect for that song. Annie Lennox, written by Howard Shore, who wrote all the music for the thing and her. And they say one of the producers, but I think they just keep their name on it. Anyway, so here's the scene. And this is what really the talk's about. So Treebeard, also known as Fangorn, half man, half tree, is there. Galadriel and Celeborn, her husband, two very important elves in the story, are there. Gandalf is there. The elves walk down Stock Road to get there. Kind of interesting. Why did he pick that to put right there, the Stock Road? But he did. So they're all there and they're saying goodbye because the elves are leaving. Now, all thousands of years old, except for the hobbits. And Treebeard says to the elves, "It is long, long since we met by stock or by stone." So Shippey starts talking. It's a very long chapter. It goes all over the place. And I don't even know if you find it interesting, but I'm going to tell you the few parts that I sort of remembered. So he says Tolkien's use of by stock or by stone is an echo of a 14th century poem called Pearl. We don't know who wrote Pearl, but we know he also wrote presumably a man, also wrote a story called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is also a wonderful story we're not going to talk about. And it's an elegy, it's a lament for the dead. And in the story, this father goes to sleep and he wakes up in a sort of a fantasy land. And there's a river, which represents death. There's a young woman on the other side. He's talking to her. She's not too interested. He realizes later it's his 2-year-old daughter who died. And that's what the story's about. Honestly, I'll never read it again. I can't dare anything happening to little children. I just can't. I don't want to read it. I don't want to know about it. That's just me. And it's actually supposed to be comforting story, but I don't find it so. Anyway, it's Middle English. It's written in, not Old English. Remember, Shakespeare, it's always surprises people, is modern English. It's an earlier form of modern English. People think it's Middle English, but it's not. And if you read Middle English, if you take your time, you can figure out. I think I skipped one slide. It doesn't matter. Can you go to the 4?
What did Chaucer write?
Chaucer wrote in Middle English. Yeah, and when Chaucer wrote, the world was changing in England in terms of language. French, because remember, 1066, the French invaded, took over, and he was a fairly substantial person. He was sort of a diplomat, not the most important, but he had some important. So his language, English starts becoming French in a lot of ways. So anyway, this top one right there, we see "be meeting so seldom by stock, other stone." Now, that's translated by a guy named E.V. Gordon, and it means we meet. We met is meet, so seldom is seldom now, by stock. And I'm going to explain what stock means. Other is a way to say or. Stone. We meet so seldom by stock or stone. Now, E.V. Gordon is given credit for it. He actually wrote it with Tolkien. Then E.V. Gordon died. Tolkien took it over, never did a thing with it. after that and gave it to Gordon's wife, who was also, by good luck, a philologist. And she finished it. She gets no credit for it, but E.B. Gordon does. Now, later on, Tolkien wrote his own thing. And it's funny, because even though in The Lord of the Rings, he uses by stock or by stone, here, instead of putting those words, he says, we meet on our roads by chance so rare. So when you look at it, so rare, we meet so seldom. It's the same thing. For stock or stone, he uses on our roads, which is not what it means. I'm gonna get there very shortly, exactly what it does mean. So he knew, of course, exactly what it meant, stock. He actually wrote a Middle English vocabulary when he was still a young man. And he defines stock himself as a stem or a tree trunk. And I, believe it or not, actually own something called the Compendious Anglo-Saxon and English Dictionary, which defines stock as a stem, trunk, block, or stick. So it's part of a tree. Some part of a tree, it can be the whole tree also.
Didn't you say before that some group was coming down the Stock Road?
When that meeting with the elf and the half tree, the hobbits are coming and they write down Stock Road. It's the same word. And I never noticed when I read the book that at all. I'm just not paying attention to stuff like that. So I'm talking now about Shippey, of course. So Shippey then says, what this is in Tolkien is an echo from Stock or Stone written by the guy who wrote Pearl. And he gives two other examples of people who, poets, who use the same phrase. He says, so one of them was William Wordsworth. Anybody familiar with him? Right? Famous English writer. He's sort of, him and Samuel Coleridge, sort of, I don't know the right word, created what's known as English poetic romanticism. Romanticism, I don't know if it's even real. It's a era where Beethoven was considered a romantic composer, late 1700s to sort of about the middle of the 19th century.
But it doesn't mean what we think it means today, does it?
No, it's really, I'm going to get to what I think it means, because there's no real definition. I've even read a book where it says you can say it doesn't even exist if you want. This is what I think. Anyway, so Wordsworth wrote a poem called A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal. And I told myself I'm going to try to perform the first stanza. And I'll put up the second stanza for you. So when Sam, I just wanted to do this because I love Sam from The Lord of the Rings. Sam is Frodo's helper. He's a gardener's son, or the gardener for Frodo. And he's just, I think he's Tolkien. And to me, he's the real hero. He's the only mortal who the ring has no effect on. Always does the right thing. Frodo often does the wrong thing. So anyway, when he would tell a poem, he'd do it like he was a school. He'd put his hands behind his back. So, a slumber did my spirit seal. I had no human fears. She seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly years. That's the first stanza. I like it for one reason. It reminds me of The Lord of the Rings, even though it was written somewhere between 1800 and 1850, I forget when. So it's way before Tolkien. But she seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of human years. That describes half the characters in Lord of the Rings. The elves who never die, the Gollum, the little distorted former hobbit, who, because of the ring, just ages and ages, doesn't seem to die. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, if you could put up 5, that'll work. You can do it. So this is the second stanza. No motion has she now, no force. She neither hears nor sees. Rolled round in earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees. So the importance of it, and this is also a lament for someone dead, the importance of it is, Shippey says, rocks and stones and trees, well, trees, a sort of stop, And he criticizes it. He says Wordsworth, a great poet, but the worst linguistic critic. He should have put stocks and stones. But he didn't. He wanted alliteration with the rolled and the rounds and the rhymes. So that's Shippey's idea. Wordsworth, I'll just tell you a little more about him, wrote a number of poems. Quite sad about a little girl named Lucy who died. Just sounds a lot like the Pearl. And they're called the Lucy poems. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading them. To me, they're quite sad. This one doesn't mention Lucy, but you know, scholars think it's, you know, one of those poems about her. Probably his daughter, who died at age 3. But believe me, there's all kinds of theories I've read of who it really is. And that's what literature professors would like, they like to do. They want to sell books. You can't just say it's his daughter. You have to say, no, it was his secret mistress or, you know, sister, or all who, you know, passed away. Okay, so I read it. Now, I did not, when I read this, and Shippey said, that's an echo also from Pearl, I just said, okay, it's 2003. Later, when I was sort of going through and exploring it, I said, you know, I think he's just wrong. It's not an echo of Pearl. It doesn't say stocks and stones for a reason, because it wasn't an echo. If you read Wordsworth, everything he writes is about nature. It's just very common for him. When Thoreau, I think this was in his journal, Thoreau told a story, and I can't find an earlier version. So I don't know where Thoreau got it. I'm sure he didn't make it up. He said when Wordsworth died, someone went to the house and asked to see his study. And his maid then said, this is the master's library where he keeps his books, but his study is out of doors. And in his masterpiece, I'll call it, The Recluse, which was his biography, and he wrote it not that long before he died. It was a poetic biography. He wrote as follows: earth's materials wait upon my step, pitches her tents before me as I move. He's practically saying there, I write about sticks and stones. So Shippey thought that that was an echo and that Tolkien was an echo of it. I disagree. The other one that Shippey mentions, and I'm going through all this for a reason, you're going to see why in a little bit, is John Milton, the famous poet from the 1600s, British, who wrote something called The Late Massacre at Piedmont, which was a slaughter of Protestants. John Milton was a Protestant by Catholics in the 1600s in France. And it was a famous event at the time. And the last sentence, well, no, forgive me, it's the middle of the last sentence of the stanza, when all our fathers worship stocks and stones, which is the title of his chapter. Now, I later wrote to Shippey, who responded to me, and I love that authors now will do this, because we all have email, and you can write to authors. Almost every author but one I've ever written to has written me back. And he wrote me a long letter back too. He told me that Milton could not possibly have read the Pearl because it wasn't discovered until the 1800s. So Wordsworth could have. But he thought it was an echo. Why did he use those same phrase, stocks and stones? He used it because it was just a phrase that had somehow come through over time that people lost track of what it meant. For example, have you ever said, land's sakes? I don't even know what that means. I don't know if you ever said it. It's more an old expression, like oh my God, what's going on here? I don't know, it sounds like it's some country. You ever hear if I had my druthers? Okay, where's that from? It's druthers is would rather. It's a Southern expression, but we don't know. We know the words. We don't know where from. I'll tell you, it's a silly story, but I was in Sweden in '85. So I'm a young man, and I go over there, and I'm staying with some kids who don't work at all because in Sweden they said you don't have to. They just pay for you. But they sort of, enough people work, so it works. But anyway, they looked better than I did. I was a lawyer. Seriously, they had a beautiful apartment. So anyway, I'm there and we're talking about various things about our different countries. And I use the expression, a piece of cake. I will tell you, I have never gotten such laughter in my life. They were literally rolling on the floor. A piece of cake. They all spoke English perfectly. A piece of cake, that is so funny. What the hell does that mean? Because it's a piece of, now I'm gonna ask you, we use the expression, what does it mean?
Easy, something easy.
Something easy, where's it come from? Why would you say a piece of cake is easy? They don't know, but they think it's from, it used to be a prize when there was a dance contest. And somehow that came to mean as easy. Maybe the first place in print is Ogden Nash, the poem, maybe, who knows?
Piece of cake.
But anyway, so a year later, I met a young woman from Sweden on another trip. And we became friends, we wrote back and forth, and we lost touch for 30 years. A couple of years ago, I found her son on the internet, because I remember the last thing I remember, she had a son. I remembered his name. So I looked him up and I wrote him a letter and I enclosed a picture I had of her and her father, his father, who was with her. And I said, I just don't want you to think I'm crazy. I actually took this picture, we were going to show it to her, she'll know. So she started writing me, we went back and forth. And I said, I just want to ask you a question. Did you ever hear the expression, a piece of cake? And she wrote back, yes, we use that in Sweden, but only in English. And I'm convinced that is because of it. Maybe it's not, I don't know, but I'm convinced I started with that one. But anyway, the point is that these words get lost in time and we no longer know the real meaning of them. You're gonna see it's very true with Stock and Stone. So I read Shippey back in 2003. I thought, oh, what a pleasant alliteration. It obviously stuck in my head, as you'll see, and I didn't analyze it at all until much later.
Now, recently, a book came out about lost words in the past. I'm trying to think where I read that. Yeah,
I'm
somebody
sure it's
wrote a
fascinating.
book that includes all these words that no longer used.
Oh, sure, there are many. Stock is one of them. We don't use stock. We don't use Stock and Stone English anymore. Anyway, so when I read Lord of the Rings, which is probably in the early 1980s, I read that scene, but I didn't even notice the word Stock or Stone. I didn't think, I had no thought about it. And again, I will point to the two little sayings I pointed out at the beginning. It's not what you look at, it's what you see. When I was looking at Shippey, I was just seeing his words, seeing what he said and saying, okay, and accepting it. And I didn't know I was about to step on this road, which would take me someplace completely different. So now for my own story. When I tell my grandkids stories, I start with, once upon a time,
I have to do that too.
it was 2013. I always ask them, I say, how do your story start? Once upon a time. So it was 2013. And since it's about 7 years, I'm into studying ancient Greek. I'm not sure why I did it. I wanted to translate the Iliad and the Odyssey. That was my goal. I know Thoreau spoke fluent in English, Greek. Like I said, he's my literary hero. I saw this guy, Francis Fukuyama, on C-SPAN, who was a scholar, and Brian Lamb said to him, didn't you teach yourself ancient Greek to translate the Iliad? He goes, yeah, he goes, I forget it all, which is also true of me. I learned to do it, translated the Iliad and the Odyssey, and we barely make out any of it. It's only 10 years later. That's what happens when you don't learn languages young. It will not stick in your head. So it's 7 years into it. It took me 3 years to feel I could start translating. And I did it every day. I was very disciplined. And what's it? So 4 more about 4 more years, and I'm almost at the end. And I come to this part where Hector, we know who Hector is, right? So he's the good guy of the Iliad who gets killed by Achilles. And he's thinking about whether or not he should go out there and fight. There's a very poignant scene with his wife and his family. It's one of the nicer parts of the Odyssey, which is really mostly about putting your spear through somebody else. And I came across this phrase, and I'm trying to translate it. And I know there's a tree in it, and I know there's rocks in it, but I don't know what it is. So the book I'm reading is called From Loeb's Library. Harvard, I think Harvard puts it out. It's a series of books in Greek and Latin. So this is just the way I did it. So I taught myself ancient Greek, and then I read the Greek part, and I torture myself trying to translate it. Sometimes it's easy for me, sometimes I can't. And on the right is English, so I can just look over if I have to and see what it means. So, and this is the writer of it is long dead. His name is Murray. He's my favorite translator because it was an archaic style of English he used, but I like that for old stories. I mean, there's, they didn't talk in Old English, ancient Greece, but it just fits for me. Yeah.
Just step back a second. You said that if you learn a language when you're very young,
Yeah.
that you'll never
Yes.
to come you will,
Yeah.
let's say you learned it in high school or.
Right.
And it struck me because a few years ago, we were on a river cruise and we became friendly with two sisters and their husband. And in Germany, she said, my father, we lived in Germany for a few years. My father had some kind of a job at the embassy. And she was in elementary school at the time. So we're going to the restaurant, it's full in German. I had no idea what was on. She was able to talk in German to the
I
waiter.
believe it. Yeah, I was a horrible.
And she said, I know, she said, I haven't been here over 60 years, but it all came back.
I was a horrible French student, the worst in my class, but I remember more French. And then I do Greek, and I spent years studying. It's amazing. Anyway, I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna start going really fast. I apologize. So here's what I read in English. In no wise may I know, from oak tree or from rock, hold dalliance with him. What the hell does that mean? It was so stilted and awkward. So there are I have many translations of the OLLI. I went and got Richard Latimer, who writes more modern English. And he goes, there's no way anymore from a tree or a rock to talk to him gently. So what he's saying is Hector is saying, I can't talk to this guy, he's an animal. But that phrase from oak tree or rock is there. And he says, Murray had a footnote, and I looked at the footnote. It said this phrase recurs a number of times in Greek literature and appears to be a quotation from an old folk tale dealing with the origin of mankind from trees or stones. And something hit me. I'm like, I've read something like this before, and I don't think I know where. And I go to my bookshelf. I pull out the old copy of Shippey that I had bought secondhand after I had read the book. And I start looking for it. I find this chapter, and I find what he says, that Tolkien got this phrase from Pearl. And I realized he's just wrong. So I said to myself, I wonder, this is ancient Greek, this is Homer using essentially the same phrase. He says tree and stone, but and that's one back. Let's see if I can go back. Oak tree or tree, the same word to mean oak tree or tree, just trust me on that. He uses this, oops. So I'm like, where did this start, this expression? So I go online, and it's just such a powerful feeling. I'm gonna show you, like, people who wrote books, I know more than they do, just because I have the internet, no other reason. So I start looking, and I find this article by a guy named Alexander Fort. And Alexander Fort is a student at Harvard, and he wrote this article basically called, if I can find it, can't find the name, but it's on Stock and Stone. It's on that phrase. And he explains in it that it's not just found in Homer, it's found in Plato. He gives 3 different examples. It's found in Hesiod. The 3 of them together are considered the 3 greatest writers in ancient Greek. Homer and Hesiod are probably not real people at all. They're probably a collection of people they just call call by that name now. But they're the three who people still read to this day. Trust me, you don't want to read Aristotle. It's like the worst, most boring thing you've ever read. So anyway, I'm reading this article and he explains that it not just goes back to ancient Greece, but it found it in phraseology in Ugarit, which is northern Syria, in a place called Ras Shamra. And that's 13th century BC. Homer was probably 675 BC, they don't really know. So that's another 600-700 years earlier. And he goes, there's a picture from the same place where from the 18th century BC. So, and he talks about it and he says, this is what it means. The phrase comes, speech coming from oak or tree and rock. It's a metaphor for thunder and lightning. It represents divine, oracular, or prophetic speech and generative power. That is the origins of man. And he said, probably we don't know if Homer or Plato even knew that it used to mean this. So I started looking on the internet. I don't have time. I didn't realize I would speak so long. So I found dozens and dozens of stock and stone. It's still used in Germany in advertisements. I have Chaucer. I have Shakespeare. I couldn't believe how many things I find. And then you start to say, but how come, but it doesn't seem to mean any of these things. It's just when you read the writers, they're just using it like Wordsworth did, rocks and stones and trees. They're just rocks and stones and trees. So the meaning got completely, I found one author who wrote a book in 1994 in German. And I speak German from Hogan's Heroes, like all of you. I know 4 words maybe, but I got his book. And it's amazing what you can do. A lot of, German's a little bit like English still. And I used Google and I read the book because I was afraid he was gonna know my discovery before I did. So, and he did, he just mentions all these examples through history. He says it goes back 5,000 years. So here's the thing, and I'm speeding along because it's really an hour and a half book, I guess. It seems this has come down, this phrase, stock and stone, stripped of its meaning now. And it stopped in, I don't know, 1600, something like that with Milton. And then, because like I said, Wordsworth didn't even really use it. But now's the question, what did Tolkien mean in the book when he had it? Once you see the connection, you will see Tolkien knew exactly what it meant and he used it. No. Okay, let's go through what Forte says the things are. Speech coming from oak and rock. Treebird is a talking tree. Could that possibly be a coincidence that Tolkien has him use this speech and it's coming from a talking? I guess it could be the greatest literary coincidence of all time. It seems, when I realized that, I remember Janice, I swear to God I said this myself from Friends. She goes, oh my God. That's really, it's everything you want to know, but it's more. Galadriel's there. She's one of the queens of the elves. She's the prophetess. She's the oracular person. And she makes a prophecy while they're talking about when they will meet again. And then Gandalf says to Treebird that it was the new age of man and their kingdom may even outlive him. Remember, Treebird's thousands of years old, which is regenerative power, the origins of man. It's all there in one paragraph in Tolkien. And the amazing thing is that Tolkien has this phrase that he uses the way they used it in ancient Ugarit. So I started researching Tolkien. And here's what I found. They were digging up Ugarit. Well, he was a professor at Oxford. They made speeches there. They had experts who were in the language department. he almost certainly knew. Now, did he learn this phrase from him? I don't know. I mean, there's certain things you can find out in history or literature, certain things you can't. But it was amazing to me that he had used it this way. Now, he used stock and stone in The Lord of the Rings in one other place. And he used it just like Wordsworth did. It was, Treebird was speaking again, but it was just about rocks and stone. So he knew the difference between using it to have this ancient meaning and just the way it's used by people like Wordsworth or Milton or things like that. So, I mean, this is what I found. And two other things about Tolkien. Remember, the whole book is really about the coming age of man and the end of the, what do you want to call it, the romantic age or the fantasy age. He never mentions religion in The Lord of the Rings because they are the living religion that you're reading. So, Thoreau had an expression, I think it's the next.
Last paragraph, where it says, at the end of here,
Whoops, I'm sorry.
Gabriel's prophecy that they will all meet.
Oh, so this is another example of
That's like the resurrection story.
well, it's also a very religious book.
Oh, okay.
Tolkien said that it's a very religious story. So this is Thoreau again. Some circumstantial evidence is very strong, is when you find a trout in the milk. How did that trout get in the milk? Somebody put it there, right? So it's circumstantial, but we know it's true. And I feel that same way with Tolkien. I mean, we know about his knowledge of languages. We know that they were studying Ugarit while he was there at Oxford. We know he's read all these people. We also know that he knows ancient Greek, and he said, I think it's the next slide. I was brought up in the classics and first discovered the sin of literary pleasure in Homer. So here's the thing, and I'm probably going to have to end with this. So I want to show you, I'll teach you a little ancient Greek. I'm comparing Treebird's speech to Hector's. Okay, so this is the Greek. Apo means, it's a preposition. It really means away from or from. Treebeard uses a preposition. Druce, believe it or not, it's the word tree actually probably comes from this word, even though it doesn't look like it. D's and T's and THs are almost the same sound. Then R, U, and ends in S, but endings always got cut off. You change languages. So anyway, that's a noun, stock, tree or tree. A conjunction, or, this means or, and, or not, or. And this means another preposition, same one. And this is stone. So why is this important? I'm going to tell you why. Because I've read dozens of these other writers across time, and none of them use this formulation. Only Tolkien does. And I found that like incredible proof. So, really wind up fast now. So I found it one more place, and I couldn't believe it. When I started, I wrote this up as a paper, footnotes and whatever, 25 pages, never done anything with it really, showed it to a few friends. But I said, wouldn't it be fun if I could find my third favorite writer, Homer, Tolkien, Thoreau? Wouldn't it be fun if I could find something? So I started reading, and I said, well, it can't just be mentioning stones and trees. So frozen on the trees and rattle like stones in my pocket, I found. Big deal, it's nothing about talking trees or oracular speech. This one's too long to read right now, but he uses rocks and trees. Again, it's ordinary. And then I come to this one, and again, it was, oh my God. The only other person I could find since Homer or Plato at least, who had an understanding of what this meant is Thoreau, my other favorite writer. It would imply the regeneration of mankind, which is exactly what it meant. if they were to become elevated enough to truly worship sticks and stones, which is ironic. He uses stick instead of stock because he's writing in American English, but he's quoting Milton. And I will tell you that I know that at Harvard at the time, they studied two things, maybe Homer and Milton. Or they were certainly very big things. So he says it right there, the regeneration of man. Unlike Tolkien, where you figure out from circumstantial evidence, he understood the ancient language. He just says it. He's pretty much writing for himself. They didn't have like really readers back
So
then.
does that mean get closer to nature by worshiping sticks and stones?
Well, that's from Milton.
Right.
That's from his poem about the massacre at Piedmont, back when men worshiped sticks and stones. Again, I don't think Milton knew the ancient expression. He just had stock and stone in his head because it was a common expression.
If they were worshiping, I get the tree one, but it's not.
Well, no, this one, I'm not saying this one, this
No,
just
no,
one sees.
people worshiping sticks and stones, would stones be like the circles of stones we see?
It could be, he was probably, and again, I had to leave this part out, it just got too long. Both him and Wordsworth knew all about Druids. The Druids supposedly created Stonehenge, not in real life, but at least in the imagination of the Brits. And I think he was talking about back when all men worship. I think he was talking about the Druids.
Trees and the
Yeah.
rocks, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what Milton meant, but I'm just looking really at what Thoreau meant when he mentions the regeneration of mankind. That's it exactly. So,
So the road wasn't, he wanted to go back to the old ways,
no, he was,
said the regeneration of mankind.
yeah, don't read it any more than a sentence. He was writing a thing and it was just something. When Thoreau wrote, he traveled all over. It was cogent and beautiful, but he was writing about a specific thing. If you want, anybody who wants any quote from here or whatever, just write to me and I'm happy to give it to you. I just want to, one more thing. Oh, okay, so Annie Hall, there's this great scene where he's online in a movie with Diane, whatever her name is. And this professor's behind him, and he's talking to a young woman, maybe trying to impress her, about Marshall McLuhan, who wrote The Medium is the Message. And Woody's like, and finally the guy says, excuse me, but like, you know, I happen to be a professor of literature at so-and-so university. And Woody says to him, oh, really? Well, I have Marshall McLuhan right here. And he walks over and he pulls out Marshall McLuhan. It's a ridiculous scene. And Marshall McLuhan says to the professor, you really should not be teaching a course in me at all. And Woody turns to the audience and says, it'd be great if real life was like this. And I'm telling that story because that's what happened to me. So I wrote to two people. I wrote to Shippey and I wrote to 40. Sent them my paper. And I was scared to death that Shippey was going to say to me, you really should not be writing about my book at all. But I want to tell you, they both wrote me back long, very nice letters. I'm not going to get to them. So Shippey wrote me back, like I said, a long letter. But then he put in this, and how often in life do you get this? I'm writing to the world's greatest expert on Tolkien and saying you're wrong. And I apologized to him. I said, please don't be mad at me. I'm a big fan. I've read your books, whatever. He goes, but I'm sure you were right about the deep roots of the phrase I quoted. It must have been part of the poetic proverbial phraseology inherited from remote antiquity and still surviving in popular speech in a random sort of way. That's basically my theory, and I came down and Tolkien used it, and he's agreeing with me. It was a great moment in my life, I gotta tell you. And then I wrote to Alexander Fort, the young man. By the way, he looks like Jesus Christ with glasses like him. He's still a young man. He teaches, he's a professor at MIT now, I think. And he also wrote me a long, really nice letter and said, I'm sure you're correct that Tolkien is thinking of home there. He said possibly also Plato, maybe, but again, this is my whole thesis. So it was just incredibly rewarding to me. I put in a lot of work in it, believe me. This is not, I'm talking about it in an hour, but it took me days and days, and then I wrote it over months.
Did you write those letters?
No, they're emails. They're emails.
Oh.
So I have them I looked them up so I could put them in here. Anyway, I had more, but we have probably exceeded the hour. There's many other things in Tolkien I found, just little words that are clearly from the Greek. And I was just gonna translate them and show them to you. Probably doesn't even matter so much because most of you haven't read The Lord of the Rings, so you'd say, well, who are they, those people are? Well, she has, I know. Well, if you want later, I'll tell you. But anyway, I think that's gonna have to be it. So I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you in TV land for listening.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you like
That was
that.
Yeah, it was good, thank you.
Thank you.
It was a real
Good stuff.
adventure for me, I have to say.
Yeah.
You know, sitting there and when, again, it was when I read Homer, this was 7 years after I read Shipping. And just having that feeling in your head, like, I know I've read this before. Like, where did I read it? And then finding this adventure on the internet. So it's fun for me.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So, and by the way, when I mean when I say, I haven't read everything in Tolkien world without, you know, whatever. I am pretty sure I'm the only one who ever discovered this. And no one else has ever written, because I've looked, I mean, as
Right.
hard as I could. And I don't think anybody, so the only people who know are the few people I've told or sent my paper
Maybe
to.
the next essay they do on the topic, those two.
You know, I think I'm really bad entrepreneurial. I don't know how to do anything. I'm a lawyer, so I should, but I just can't. So there are all these things where you can write about Tolkien, and I just never send anybody anything. I think it'd be a good subject for it.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Well,
David.
yeah, well, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.
Thanks again.
Thanks.
Thank you for helping. So, any